Chapter 1. The Road That Breathes at Night. The car died 3 miles outside of Ashvale, on a road that had no business existing. Marisolis had driven this highway a dozen times over the past 2 summers, ferrying boxes between her old life in Portland and the rented cottage she kept pretending she'd fix up. She knew its curves. She knew the way the asphalt dipped just past the guardrail where the creek ran beneath it, and the particular way the radio always lost signal before the tree line swallowed the last bar of civilization. She knew this road. She did not know why it had never frightened her before tonight. The engine gave a single polite cough and then went silent. The headlights held for 3 seconds, long enough for her to register the deer path cutting into the pines, the wall of fog that had thickened without permission while she wasn't watching, the pale reflective glow of the road markers ahead, and then they went out too. "Okay," she said aloud. Her voice sounded different in the sudden dark, smaller, like something had absorbed it before it could travel far. She tried the ignition twice. The engine turned over and produced nothing, not even the wheeze of a trying thing. The dashboard was dark. Her phone, balanced on the cuff holder, showed 1 bar of signal and a battery at 11%. She sent a single text to her neighbor, Mrs. Albrecht. "Car broke down on Route 9. Going to walk to the Ashvale pull-off. Don't worry." Then she pulled on her jacket, zipped it to her chin, and stepped out into the cold. October in this part of Oregon did not ease you into anything. The cold here was personal. It had weight and intention. And it found the gaps between your collar and your jaw with the precision of something that had been waiting. Mara hunched into herself and started walking. The fog had settled so completely that she could see perhaps 15 feet ahead before the world dissolved into nothing. The pines on either side of the road were shapes, tall, indifferent, older than anything she had known in the city. She had been walking for 6 minutes. She was counting, had always counted, a habit from a childhood that required watchfulness. When she felt it, the feeling was not a sound. It was not a movement she could point to. It was the sensation of weight being placed on the air behind her, the way a room changes when someone enters it while your back is turned. Mara stopped walking. She turned. The road behind her was fog and dark and nothing. The pines stood where they had always stood. The night breathed. She could hear it now, she realized, or rather she could hear the absence of the usual sounds. No insects. No wind moving through the upper branches. The kind of silence that arrives when something larger than the usual things has entered the territory. Then she saw it. At the edge of the tree line, not on the road, but at the exact margin where asphalt became gravel and gravel became root-threaded earth, a pair of eyes. Not the flat orange flash of a deer in headlights. These were different. They were pale, and they were watching her with a quality that no animal she could name had ever directed at her. There was an intelligence in it that she felt before she understood it, the way you understand heat before you understand fire. The eyes did not blink. They did not move. They were set low enough that whatever owned them was large, not crouching but simply large, and they were the color of amber just before the resin goes dark. Mara did not run. She had thought about this moment in the abstract way that women who drive alone at night sometimes do, the thought experiment of what would you do, the imagined bravery or imagined cowardice. She had always assumed she would run. Instead, she stood very still and felt her heartbeat, which had not panicked so much as focused, the way a lens focuses light into a single hot point. "I see you," she said. She did not know why she said it. The words had arrived before the decision. The eyes did not move, but something shifted, a quality in the stillness, a change in the weight of the attention being paid to her. If she were pressed to name it, she would have said the thing in the dark became, for 1 second, surprised. Then a truck rounded the curve behind her, headlights sweeping the road, and Mara spun instinctively toward the light. She threw her arm up, waving. The truck slowed. A man named Dale Cutter who ran feed deliveries out to the ranches past Ashvale. And he leaned out the window with a familiar weathered face and asked if she needed a ride. "Yes," she said. "Please." She got in. And only when the truck had moved another 100 yards down the road did she turn and look back through the rear window at the place where the road disappeared into fog. There was nothing there. No eyes. No shape at the tree line. Nothing that would confirm what she had seen or give her reason to report it, if she'd had someone to report it to. But the fog, just at the margin of her visibility, had been disturbed, not by wind. There was no wind. disturbed in the way that air is disturbed when something large and very quiet has turned and moved away into the dark. Mara faced forward. Dale was talking about the cold front coming in, about his daughter's soccer tournament, about the new coffee machine at the Asheville diner that everyone was having opinions about. She answered in the correct places. She watched the road unspool in the headlights and listened to the ordinary world reassemble itself around her, brick by brick. But her hands folded in her lap did not stop trembling until the first lights of Asheville came into view. And even then, the trembling did not entirely stop. It moved inward, into the part of her that had recognized something in those pale, ancient eyes. Not threat. Something older than threat. Something that looked at her as though it had been waiting a very, very long time. Chapter 2. The town that keeps its mouth shut. Asheville was the kind of town that had decided, at some point in its history, that certain things were better left undiscussed. Mara had noticed it on her first visit 2 summers ago, a particular quality in the way conversations ended when they drifted toward the forest, or toward the ridge that locals called the Black Shelf, or toward any mention of what had happened to the Voss family in 1987. Sentences would simply conclude early, like doors being gently but firmly pulled shut. People would look at their coffee cups. Someone would change the subject with the practiced ease of long habit. She had chopped it up to small-town insularity. Now, sitting in a corner booth at Della's diner with both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug and the heat of the place working slowly through her jacket, she wasn't sure that explanation had ever been sufficient. The diner was the only thing open past 9 in Asheville. It smelled of burnt coffee and fried onions and something faintly sweet. The pie case beside the counter held 3 slices of something dark and spiced, and the handwritten card in front of it said Blackberry Bramble, Ask Della. The overhead lights were the old warm yellow kind that made everyone look like they were sitting inside an amber photograph. 4 other people occupied the space, 2 ranchers at the counter, a teenage girl doing homework in the far booth, and an older man in a canvas jacket reading a folded newspaper with the focused attention of someone who was not actually reading it. Dale had dropped her at the curb with a cheerful wave and the offer of a jump start in the morning. She had thanked him and come inside and ordered coffee and was now, 20 minutes later, still sitting with it because the alternative was walking the 2 remaining blocks to her cottage, and she found unexpectedly that she was not ready to be alone yet. She was on her 2nd cup when the woman slid into the seat across from her. "You are the Solis girl," the woman said. "The one who rents the Pryor cottage?" She was perhaps 60, with the particular leanness of someone who worked outdoors and had never bothered to stop. Silver hair pulled back, eyes the color of creek water, gray-green, clear, with something watchful in them. She was wearing a flannel shirt and an expression that suggested she had decided to have this conversation several minutes before Mara had noticed her. "I am," Mara said carefully. "Mara, and you're Bet Calloway. I run the historical archive on Spruce Street." She folded her hands on the table. They were ink-stained. "You walked Route 9 tonight." It was not a question. "My car broke down," Mara said. "Dale Cutter gave me a lift." Bet looked at her for a moment with an expression Mara couldn't cleanly categorize. Not alarm, not pity. Something in between, the look of a person who has done a calculation and arrived at a number they were hoping not to find. "See anything on the road?" Bet asked. The diner noise continued around them. The scrape of a fork, the murmur of the ranchers of the counter, the distant sound of the kitchen. Mara thought about the eyes at the tree line, the disturbed fog, the silence that had arrived like a presence before the presence itself. "A deer," she said. "I think." Bet held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then she nodded, slowly, in the way of someone who has been lied to by someone who doesn't yet know enough to lie better. "Route 9 runs along the eastern boundary," Bet said. She kept her voice low, not conspiratorial, just quiet. "The way you speak when you are delivering information rather than gossip. Most people don't have trouble on it. Occasionally someone does. You want my advice. You don't walk that stretch after dark again." "Because of wildlife?" Mara asked. "Because of the boundary," Bet said, as though this explained everything. She stood tacking something back into her flannel pocket, a small notebook. Mara caught a glimpse of dense handwriting before it disappeared. "Come by the archive sometime. Bring your questions." She walked back to the counter without looking back, took a stool beside the rancher's, and picked up her own coffee as though the conversation had been entirely unremarkable. Mara sat with what had just happened for a long moment, the boundary. She turned the word over. It had weight. Bet had not said a boundary, or the forest boundary, or any phrase that would have given it context and reduced it to something ordinary. She had said the boundary the way you say the sun, as though there could only be one, as though everyone in hearing range already knew what it was. The teenage girl in the far booth was watching her. When Mara looked over, the girl dropped her eyes immediately back to her textbook, but not before Mara registered the expression on her face. Not curiosity, something more careful. The look of someone who had been told, probably more than once, not to stare at certain kinds of strangers. Mara left cash on the table, pulled her jacket back on, and walked out into the Ashvale night. The town was small enough that its handful of streetlights did real work. She could see the full length of Main Street from the diner door, the hardware store, the post office, the darkened window of what had once been a pharmacy and was now apparently a seasonal candle shop. The mountain behind the town was invisible in the dark, except as an absence, a mass of starless sky. She was halfway to the cottage when she felt it again, not the same as on the road. Not that particular quality of being observed by something outside herself. This was different. This was more like the feeling you get sometimes in the instant before waking, when you are aware that a dream has been happening but can no longer access its contents. A resonance. An echo of something she had no language for. She stopped on the sidewalk and looked up. The moon had broken through the cloud cover. It sat above the ridgeline, 3/4 full, and the light it cast was the particular cold silver that made ordinary things look like illustrations of themselves. The street, the storefronts, the mountain, and at the top of the ridge, so far away that it should have been impossible to see, and yet she saw it with a clarity that made her question her own perception, a shape, still, facing downward, facing with a direction that carried all the weight and intention of a choice toward her. It was gone before she could be certain it had been there, a shift of cloud across the moon, and when the light returned the ridge was empty and undisturbed, and entirely unconvincing in its emptiness. Mara let herself into the cottage, locked the door, and stood in her dark kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights. In her chest, beneath the fear and beneath the adrenaline and beneath the entirely reasonable voice telling her to call a mechanic in the morning and drive back to Portland the moment her car started, something else was present. Something quiet and very old, and this was the part she couldn't reconcile. Something that felt against all logic, like recognition. Chapter 3. The man who smells like the forest after rain. She found him at the archive. Not because she had gone looking. Or that was what she told herself on the 2-block walk down Spruce Street the next morning. Her car retrieved and parked and mechanically inexplicable in its recovery, the engine turning over without complaint when Dale jumped it, as though the breakdown had never happened at all. She had gone to see Bet. She had gone because of the word boundary and the notebook with the dense handwriting, and the particular way Bet Calloway had looked at her like a calculation with an unwelcome answer. The man was simply there when she arrived. The Ashvale Historical Archive occupied a narrow Victorian building that leaned very slightly to the left, as though listening to something happening underground. The front room was floor-to-ceiling shelving, the shelves holding a combination of actual archival boxes, local history paperbacks, and what appeared to be a collection of ham-labeled glass jars containing pressed botanical specimens. Bet was behind the front desk, doing something industrious with a date stamp. The man was standing at the far end of the room with his back to the door, reading from an open folder he'd taken from one of the shelves. Mara's first impression was height. Her second was stillness, not the stillness of someone absorbed in reading, which has a quality of leaning into the text, but the stillness of someone who had already heard the door open and had made a deliberate choice not to turn. Her third impression arrived a half-second later and was harder to name, the sense that the room had been rearranged by his presence without anything having actually moved. The air pressure was different. The proportions had shifted. Mara. Bet looked up with the unsurprised expression of someone who had expected this. "Come in, I'll put the kettle on." She disappeared through a door behind the desk. The man at the far end of the room turned a page in his folder. Mara walked in. She chose a table near the center of the room, not far from him, not close, and set her bag down and pretended to be interested in the nearest shelf. which held a row of spiral-bound volumes labeled Asheville Township Census Records 1901 to 1960. "You won't find what you're looking for in those," the man said. His voice was low, not quiet in the way of someone being careful, low in the way that certain sounds are low, with a resonance that belonged to the frequency of the room rather than imposing upon it. He still had not turned. "You don't know what I'm looking for," Mara said. "No," he agreed. He closed the folder, replaced it on the shelf with the precision of someone who remembered exactly where things belonged, and turned. Her breath did not catch. She was specific with herself about this afterward. It was not that. It was something more like the sensation of a gyroscope tilting, of some internal instrument recalibrating without her consent. He was, the word that kept arriving, unhelpfully, was present. As though most people occupied their bodies at some slight remove, and he did not. Dark hair. A jaw that looked like it had been designed with structural intent. Eyes that were, in the ordinary October morning light of the archive, a shade of amber gray that she did not have a prior reference for. He was wearing a dark canvas jacket, and he was looking at her with an expression that contained, in very careful and very controlled measure, something she could not read. He looked at her the way people look at things that require them to remain calm. "Callum Voss," he said. The name registered on a 2-second delay. Voss. The name Asheville went quiet around. The family Bet had not discussed last night when she had been delivering her careful, selected information. Mara kept her expression where it was by an act of conscious effort. "Mara Solis," she said. He nodded once. He did not offer his hand, and she noticed this. Not as rudeness, but as something chosen, a deliberate maintenance of distance, the way you maintain distance from a flame, not because you fear it, but because you know its properties, and you are being responsible. "You're the one renting the prior cottage," he said. "Why does everyone in this town know that?" "Small town," he said. It was not quite an answer. Bet reappeared with a tea tray and set it on the central table with the brisk efficiency of someone stage managing a scene they had arranged. She poured without asking, and set cups in front of both of them, and then said, "Callum knows the local history better than anyone. Better than me, arguably, and it's my archive." "It was my family's history first," he said. There was no sharpness in it. It landed flat, like a fact. Mara sat. After a moment, he sat too, not across from her, but at the end of the table, angled slightly away, in the posture of someone who has calculated the minimum socially acceptable distance and honored it exactly. "I want to know about the boundary," Mara said. She looked at Bet. "You mentioned it last night, the eastern boundary along Route 9. Bet and Callum did not look at each other. She noted this. The careful non-exchange, the way two people who have an understanding demonstrate it by its absence rather than its presence. "It's a territorial demarcation," Bet said. "Very old. Goes back to the original settlement families. The Voss family held the land east of Route 9 for generations. There are protocols around that land, local custom." "Someone was watching me on that road last night," Mara said. The room was quiet. The kettle on the back shelf ticked as it cooled. Callum had both hands flat on the table. She noticed them, large, steady, with a stillness that matched everything else about him. She noticed also that he was looking at the surface of the table rather than at her, and that his jaw had acquired a new tension, small, controlled, but present. "Wildlife is active this time of year," he said. "Along that corridor especially." "It wasn't wildlife," she said. He looked up then, full eye contact for the first time, and she understood in that instant why he had been avoiding it. Something moved in those ambergris eyes, something too fast to track, a depth that shouldn't have been visible in a look that lasted only seconds. It was like glancing into still water and seeing, briefly, that it was not still at all beneath the surface, that something large and ancient was moving down there, slow and certain. He looked away first. "You should be careful on Route 9 at night," he said. His voice had changed, fractionally, in a way she suspected most people would not notice. A roughness, contained but present. "Going forward." "You said that already," she said. "Both of you, in different words. Sometimes things need to be said more than once," Bet offered pleasantly, and refilled the cups. Mara watched Callum Voss for the rest of the visit, 40 minutes. during which Bet showed her 3 documents of local history that managed to be entirely informative about farming practices and entirely silent about anything that mattered. During those 40 minutes, Callum said 6 more things, all of them unremarkable, and all of them somehow weighted, as though each word had been selected from a larger number of possible words, and the selection had required effort. He left before her. He did not say goodbye. He said good morning to both of them, with a formality that sat strangely on him. And he walked out into the street without looking back. Mara stayed another 10 minutes. When she left, she turned left out of the archive door and found herself looking at the mountain, at the Black Shelf Ridge, clear and cold against the October sky. On the walk home, she catalogued what she knew, which was very little, and what she felt, which was considerably more than she had any framework to explain. His hands on the table, the way his jaw had tightened when she said it wasn't wildlife, the amber gray of his eyes and the thing moving beneath their surface, the smell that had reached her across the archive room, faint, involuntary, not cologne or soap, but something underneath those things, something that did not belong indoors. Pine resin, cold water, the exact particular scent of forest air after rain. Chapter 4. What the archive didn't show her, the folder he had been reading was gone. Mara noticed this on her second visit to the archive 2 days later, when she worked her way systematically along the shelves to the exact spot where Callum had stood. She had remembered it precisely, 3rd shelf from the top, between a box labeled Ashevale Founding Families, Correspondence 1891 to 1903, and a slim volume on Pacific Northwest timber rights. The gap where the folder had rested was still there, a half-inch of empty space between its neighbors. She asked Bet about it with the careful indirectness she was learning to use in this town. That section is being recatalogued, Bet said, without looking up from her desk. The answer came too quickly and landed too smoothly, which meant it had been prepared. What was in it? Mara asked. Historical documents. Bet looked up now, and her Creekwater eyes were pleasant and absolutely immovable, as you'd expect in a historical archive. Mara let it go. She had learned in 2 days of Asheville that letting things go was the faster route to actually finding them. She took a census record to a reading table and spent an hour appearing to be interested in agricultural land transfers from 1922, while actually reading the room. The archive drew a small, specific clientele. Bet herself was there every morning. An elderly man named Harlan came Tuesdays and Thursdays to work on what Bet called his local memoir, which appeared to consist primarily of Harlan reading the same 3 boxes and then falling asleep in his chair. A woman from the County Historical Society came once, collected 2 items in a preservation sleeve, and left without speaking to anyone. And on the second day, at 11:15 in the morning, Callum Voss came back. He did not look surprised to find her there. He looked instead like a man who had expected something and had been hoping to be wrong about it. He took a different section of shelving than before, farther from her table, and he moved with a precision that managed to be both natural and carefully engineered. He was not avoiding her. He was maintaining distance with the discipline of someone who has practiced it. Mara waited 20 minutes. Then she picked up her notebook and walked to the shelf beside him. The Voss family correspondence, she said, reading the box label directly in front of her. 1891. That's when the settlement began? A pause. The pause of a man deciding how much rope to extend. Officially, he said. What does that mean? He took a slow breath. She was close enough now to register it, the slight expansion of his chest, the control in the exhale. He was looking at the shelf, not at her, and the line of his jaw had that quality she had catalogued in the archive 2 days ago. Tension maintained by conscious effort. The Voss family were among the first documented settlers, he said. There were people in this valley before them. The documentation doesn't reflect that adequately. Who were the people before? He turned then, and the distance between them was less than she had realized. She had moved closer without tracking it, drawn by some navigational error she couldn't explain. His eyes, at this proximity, were not amber gray. They were amber with gray at the outer rim, like something cooling at its edges while the center held its heat. You ask a lot of questions, he said. Someone is watching me from the tree line at night, she said. I think I'm entitled. Something moved across his face, fast, controlled, almost suppressed. Almost. You've seen it again, he said. It was not a question. Last night, from the cottage window. She held his gaze, the ridge, same eyes. He turned back to the shelf. Both hands rose to grip the edge of it, a small, telling movement, the posture of someone holding themselves in place. His knuckles were, for just a moment, pale. You should consider, he said carefully, that not everything that watches you is a threat. That's a very specific thing to say. It's a true thing. It's also not a denial, she said. The silence between them had a texture now. Dense, pressurized, the kind of silence that accumulates when two people are standing on either side of something neither of them has named. Mara was aware of her own heartbeat. She was also aware, with the precision that unsettled her, of how little actual space existed between her shoulder and his arm. The archive's warmth, the smell of old paper and botanical specimens, and underneath it all, faint and persistent, pine resin and cold water. Mr. Voss Callum. Cowum. The name in her mouth felt different than she expected, familiar in a way that had no history to justify it. What's in the folder you removed from this shelf? The grip on the shelf edge tightened. She watched it happen. Archives get reorganized, he said. Bet used that exact phrase, word for word. She paused. Did you ask her to say that? He released the shelf, stepped back. Not much, 6 inches, but deliberate. The distance restored like a pressure equalizing. There are things in this town's history, he said, and his voice had dropped, not in volume but in register, as though the words were coming from somewhere deeper than conversation, that are better understood slowly, in pieces, when a person is ready for them. I'm not fragile, she said. No. He looked at her directly, and she had the disorienting sensation again, the gyroscope, the recalibration, the sense of some inner instrument adjusting to account for him. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He looked at her for a moment that lasted 4 full seconds. She counted them. In those 4 seconds she watched him make a decision and then, visibly, unmake it, watched the choice surface and then get pulled back down beneath the controlled water of his expression. Come to the East Trail tomorrow morning, he said. 6 a.m. The trail head off Route 9, north of where your car broke down. Why? Because there are things better shown than explained. He moved toward the door and then stopped without turning. Wear boots. The ground's wet after dark. He left. Mara stood in the space he had occupied and breathed in slowly through her nose. She catalogued what she knew. The missing folder, the coordinated answer from Bet, the knuckles on the shelf edge, the 4-second decision that had reversed itself. She catalogued what she felt, which was more complicated. She was frightened. That was real, and she didn't minimize it. She was also something else, a feeling that sat alongside the fear without canceling it, which was what made it interesting. It was the feeling she'd had only a few times before, standing at the edge of something true, something that had been true all along before she was there to observe it, and feeling the vertiginous pull of a threshold. She had always stepped through those thresholds. It had never once been wise, and it had never once been something she regretted. She went home and set her alarm for 5:15 and did not sleep well, and in the half-dreams that came, she saw amber-gray eyes and heard, somewhere below language, the sound of something very large moving through dark pines with a silence that was not absence, but precision. The silence of something that knew exactly what it was and where it was going. She woke before the alarm. Chapter 5. What the forest confirms the trailhead off Route 9 was a gap in the tree line marked by a wooden post with no sign on it. Just the post weathered gray, driven into the earth at some point in the past by someone who apparently felt that the kind of people meant to find this trail would already know where it was. Mara found it at 6:03 a.m. in the pewter half-light that preceded actual sunrise in October, when the sky was pale but the ground was still dark and the fog had settled into the low places between the roots. Her breath made small clouds. The trees here were older than the ones she could see from the cottage. Douglas firs with trunks 4 feet across, their bark deeply furrowed, their upper branches lost in the low ceiling of mist. They had the quality of structures rather than plants. Columns. Something with intention behind its architecture. Callum was already there. He was standing at the trail entrance with his back to the road, looking into the trees, not at them, and he turned when he heard her footsteps on the gravel. He was wearing the same dark canvas jacket. No hat, despite the cold. His hair held small beads of moisture from the fog. He looked like someone who had been outside long enough that the weather had stopped being something that happened to him and had become simply the medium he occupied. "You came," he said. "You sound surprised." "I hoped you would," he said. "That's different from expecting it." She stopped beside him and looked into the trail. It ran straight for 30 feet and then curved left into the dark between the firs, and the light beyond the curve was the kind of deep green-gray that feels underwater. The ground was soft with years of fallen needles, and it was wet, as he had said, the moisture gleaming on every surface. "Are you going to tell me what we're looking for?" she asked. "Showing," he said, "not looking." He walked into the trail and she followed. For the first 10 minutes he said nothing. This did not feel like withholding, it felt like he was giving her time to let the forest register. She understood this, gradually, as they walked. The trees changed as they moved deeper, the firs giving way in places to cedar, the cedar to hemlock, and between them the undergrowth was dense and primordial and held the particular smell of living decomposition, of things becoming other things in real time. The fog did not thin as the morning grew lighter. It moved with them, shifting between the trunks, and twice Mara had the sensation that the movement at the edge of her vision was not fog at all. "Stop," Callum said. She stopped. He was looking left, off the trail, into a section of undergrowth where a fallen fir had created a clearing. The tree had come down long ago. The wood was silver with age and soft with moss, and the clearing it had made was circular, perhaps 20 feet across. In its center, the ground was different, darker, not wet in the way the surrounding ground was wet, but marked, disturbed in a regular pattern, the compressed earth of something that had moved through here with repetition, a path that went in a circle and had been walked many times. "What made that?" Mara asked. "Come look at the tree," he said. She stepped off the trail into the undergrowth. The fallen fir was at the clearing's edge and she crouched beside it where he indicated, and in the soft, rotting wood she saw the marks. Not claw marks. She knew what those looked like, had seen black bear sign on trees before. These were different, deeper, spaced in a way that suggested something much larger and made by something moving not in distress or territory marking, but in what looked, to her reading of it, like deliberate pressure, like someone pressing their hand into clay to leave a record. "How big?" she said. It came out flat, without the question mark she'd intended. "Large," he said. Beside her now, crouching too, close enough that she could see the line of his profile and the way he was looking at the marks, not with the expression of someone encountering something strange, but with the complicated look of someone regarding something that belongs to them. Larger than a timber wolf, larger than any wolf in the existing taxonomical record. The words arrived carefully, like they had been selected from more direct words, and these had been chosen as the version she could hear first. "Callum," she said. "There are things in this valley," he said, "that have been here longer than any of the documentation in Bet's archive. The documentation begins where the history that people were willing to write down begins." He paused. "The rest is older." "The Voss family," she said. He was quiet for a moment. A bird called somewhere above the fog line. A single note, not repeated. "My family settled here because this was already ours," he said, in a way that predates settlement as a concept. "The valley, the ridge, the eastern boundary. We came here because we belonged here, because the land and the bloodline were already—" He stopped. She watched him find and discard several words, already in correspondence. She looked at the marks in the wood. She looked at the circular depression in the dark earth of the clearing. She looked at Callum Voss, crouching beside her in the fog with moisture on his jacket, and that amber heat at the center of his eyes, and she felt the threshold feeling again, the vertiginous pull of a truth that had been true before she arrived to witness it. "The eyes on Route 9, she said, "the shape on the ridge." He held her gaze and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that someone in your family has been watching me?" The pause was a fraction too long. "I'm telling you," he said, "that the boundary along Route 9 marks the edge of territory that my family has protected for a very long time, and that when someone crosses it, when someone arrives in the valley who carries something the land recognizes." He stopped again. His jaw tightened. "It gets noticed." "What does the land recognize?" she asked. "In me." He stood. The distance restored itself, that deliberate 6 inches, the pressure equalizing. He looked at her from his full height, with an expression she was beginning to catalogue. The look of a man who has already said more than he intended and is recalibrating the boundary of what he'll say next. I think, he said carefully, that your grandmother spent time in this valley. Everything stilled. Her grandmother, Lucia Solis, who had died when Mara was 11, who had kept a wooden box under her bed that she never opened in front of anyone, who had pressed dried wildflowers in the pages of her books and hummed songs that had no names, who had told Mara once, in the particular gravity of a deathbed, that some places would call to her by name before she learned their language. She never told me she'd been here, Mara said. No, Callum said quietly. I don't imagine she did. He turned back toward the trail, and she followed, and the fog closed behind them like a curtain being drawn, and the forest breathed around them with the patience of something that had been holding a very long secret and was only now, incrementally, beginning to exhale. Chapter 6. The name written before she was born. The wooden box was real. Mara had not thought about it in years, had filed it in the category of childhood memories that belonged more to atmosphere than to fact, the way certain images from that age exist as feeling rather than record. The smell of her grandmother's room, the particular weight of Lucia's hands on her face when she said goodbye, the box under the bed, dark-stained wood with a brass clasp, that Mara had asked about once and been told gently and with a finality that precluded further asking, "That's for when you're ready." She had assumed it was jewelry. Or letters. The ordinary archive of an ordinary life. She drove to her mother's house in Portland that afternoon, 3.5 hours, the whole drive, thinking in circles, and arrived at dinner time and sat at the kitchen table while her mother, Elena, made tea with the focused energy of someone who used domestic activity as emotional management. "Mama," Mara said, "did Abuela ever mention a place called Ashvale?" Elena set the kettle down. The kitchen was quiet, the particular quiet of a question landing in a space where it had been expected, in some unexamined way, for a long time. "Where did you hear that name?" Elena said. It was not inflected as a question. "I'm renting a cottage there, Route 9, outside of town." Mara watched her mother's face. "I've been there 2 summers. You never said anything." Elena sat down. She was 61 years old, and she had her mother's hands and her mother's particular quality of stillness. When confronted with something she had decided to carry alone, she looked at the table for a long moment. "She made me promise," Elena said finally, "not to bring it up unless you found it yourself." "Found what?" Elena left the kitchen and came back with the box. It was smaller than Mara remembered. Memory had made it significant, and significance had made it large, but it was in fact a modest thing, 8 inches long, 5 wide, the wood dark with age and handling. The brass clasp had gone green at its edges. Elena set it on the table between them and did not touch it further. "She said you'd know when," Elena said. Mara opened it. Inside, on a bed of deteriorated velvet, were 3 things. A pressed flower, she did not know the species, something small and white, completely desiccated. A piece of folded paper, the creases so old they had gone soft. And a small carved disc of dark wood, perhaps 2 inches across, incised on one face with a symbol she did not recognize, a circle with a line bisecting it, and from the bisecting line, branches extending at irregular angles, like a tree rendered in a language she had never been taught. She unfolded the paper. Her grandmother's handwriting, she knew it, had letters in it, had grown up reading birthday cards in its looping, careful script. But this was older. Lucia at perhaps 20, the hand less settled, more urgent. The date at the top read October 1962. The place, Ashevale, Oregon. She read it 3 times. It was not a letter. It was not addressed to anyone. It was written in the form of a record. The instinct of someone who needed to document what was happening because they didn't trust their own future memory to hold it accurately. The name Voss appeared in the 3rd line, and again in the 7th, and twice more after that, always alongside words like bond and recognition, and the valley knowing. And once, near the bottom of the page, a phrase that Mara read and then sat with in silence for a full minute. The mark appears on the 3rd night, just below the left collarbone, and I am told this has not happened in 4 generations. He is afraid of what it means. I am afraid too, but the fear and the knowing are not the same thing, and I know. Mara set the paper down. Elena was watching her with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to stop waiting. She left, Mara said. She left Ashvale. She left because she was pregnant with me, Elena said quietly. And because the situation was, she stopped. She tried again. She said some bonds were real, and some things were true, and some truths were not safe to carry in a place that didn't understand them yet. She came back to California. She had me. She kept the box. Elena looked at her hands. She said someday her blood would go back. That valleys have long memories. The drive back to Asheville took 3.5 hours in the dark. Mara arrived at 11 p.m. and went to the archive first, not expecting it to be open, finding to her unclear surprise that the lights were on. Bet answered the door in the same flannel shirt and an expression of complete unsurprise, as though she had known the knock was coming and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. "You found something," Bet said. "My grandmother was here in 1962, Mara said. She knew the Voss family." Bet stepped back and let her in without another word. The folder was back on the shelf, not the same section. It had been moved, or rather, Mara suspected now, it had been placed where she could find it. Third shelf, same wall, but 2 units to the left. She pulled it out. Inside were 7 documents, 3 pages of what appeared to be PAC records. The word PAC used without definition, as though its meaning required no establishing, and 4 pages of something older, handwritten in 2 different hands, English, and something she did not recognize. At the top of the first page, in faded ink that had once been black, right of the moonbound. Valley Compact. Asheville Territory. Enacted 1887. She read for 40 minutes. Bet brought tea and did not speak. What she understood, at the end of it, arrived in pieces that she had to assemble against her own resistance, because the shape they made was not a shape she had been raised to accommodate. PAC, bloodline, the bond that moved through generations not as inheritance but as recognition. The land knowing the blood knowing the land. The Voss line as keepers, the compact between the shifted and the unshifted, the ones who changed and the ones who carried the knowing without changing. A balance, maintained across a century and a half, that required both. That had, in 1962, very nearly collapsed. That was, according to the final annotated note in a handwriting she now recognized as Bet's own, overdue for completion. She looked up. Bet was watching her with the creekwater eyes and the expression of a woman who has been patient for a very long time and is now watching patience become unnecessary. "He knows I'm here," Mara said. "Callum, he knows what I am to the compact." "He's known," Bet said carefully, "since before you arrived, since the Bally registered your presence on Route 9. And the watching. The ridge. Route 9. He wasn't threatening you," Bet said. Mara looked at the carved disc in her palm. She had carried it from Portland without thinking. Closed in her fist the whole drive. The symbol. The circle and the branching line. "What was he doing?" she asked. Bet's expression held something that was almost, in its most restrained form, tender. "Making sure nothing else got to you first," she said. Chapter 7. The thing he should have said first. She went to find him. Not that night. The night she spent with the folder spread across the cottage kitchen table, reading and rereading until the words stopped being strange and started being something she had no name for, yet something that sat in the chest like a coal, warm and heavy, and requiring careful handling. She slept badly and woke early and made coffee and stood at the cottage window watching the ridge in the gray pre-dawn light and felt, for the first time since Route 9, that the watching she felt from that direction was not something she wanted to escape. That realization frightened her more than the watching had. She found him the next afternoon at the Eastern Trail, which she was beginning to understand was something like his threshold, the outermost point he came to, the place where his territory met the world that didn't know about it. He was sitting on the wooden post at the trailhead, which should have looked casual and instead looked like what it was, a man at the edge of his own boundary, facing outward with the posture of someone maintaining a vigil. He saw her coming from a distance. Of course he did. She was beginning to recalibrate all her assumptions about what he perceived and when. She stopped 3 feet from him and held up the carved disc. His face changed. It was the most uncontrolled thing she had yet seen from him, a fast sequence of reactions that he didn't manage to suppress in time, recognition, then something sharp and private, then a careful reconstruction of his usual composure. But she had seen the sequence. It was too late for the composure to undo it. "Where did you get that?" he said. "My grandmother left it for me," she said, along with the letter she wrote in Asheville in October of 1962, along with documentation from Bet's archive about something called the Right of the Moonbound. She paused, along with a mention of the Voss family that appears on the third line of the letter. He got off the post. He stood at the hands at his sides and looked at the disc in her palm and then at her face, and she watched him perform the same calculation she had seen him perform in the archive. How much rope? How many words? Which version of the truth? And she decided she was finished waiting for him to arrive at an answer she could find for herself. "You knew who I was before I walked into Bet's archive," she said. "You knew before we met." "Yes," he said. The honesty of it landed without softening. She had expected qualification, suspected, thought, believed, and instead he gave her the flat monosyllable, and it had the quality of something that had been held back for a long time, finally being set down. "How long?" she said. "The valley registered you 3 months before you arrived." He looked at the ridge rather than at her, and she understood now that this was not evasion, but the opposite. He looked away when he was going to say something true, because holding eye contact while doing it was apparently a level of exposure he metered carefully. "I felt it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, something shifting, something coming into alignment that had been misaligned for a long time. Since 1962, she said. Since my grandmother left. Since she left, yes." He was quiet for a moment. "She and my great-uncle. The bond that was supposed to complete the compact. She carried half of it back to California and he carried the other half for the rest of his life and neither of them." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked. "The valley has been in imbalance since then. Not catastrophically, gradually. The way a structure develops a fault that doesn't collapse anything immediately." "And I'm what?" Mara said. "The correction?" He looked at her then. Directly. Fully. With none of the careful rationing she had become accustomed to. "That's not how I think of you," he said. "How do you think of me?" The question came out with less distance than she intended. She heard it happen and did not retract it. He took a breath. Let it go. His hands, which had been still at his sides, closed briefly into fists and then opened again. "I think of you," he said, "as someone I was told about before you existed. Someone my great-uncle described to anyone who would listen in the last years of his life. Not physically, not by name, but by quality, by the shape of what she would be." He paused. He said she would ask questions that landed like stones in still water. He said she would be frightened of the right things and unfrightened of the wrong ones. Another pause. Heavier. He said she would smell like rain on dry ground, and she would walk into things that should make her run, and she would look at you like the looking itself was a form of decision. The wind moved through the upper branches of the firs. Somewhere on the ridge a raven called and was answered. "You should have told me," Mara said. Her voice was steady and she was grateful for that. "From the beginning, the archive, the trail, you had every opportunity." "Yes," he said again. "Why didn't you?" He looked back at the ridge, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because the compact isn't a choice you make," he said at last. "It never was. Not for my great-uncle, not for Lucia, not for the 6 pairs before them going back to 1887. It arises, and it's real, and it's binding in a way that has nothing to do with whether 2 people would have chosen each other freely." His voice had dropped in register, and the roughness she had heard once before was back in it, more present now. "I know what it feels like from the inside. I have felt it since the valley shifted 3 months ago. I have been aware of you, specifically and completely since before I knew your face." He turned. "And I decided," he said, "that you deserved to come to it yourself, not because I presented it to you as a fact of your life that had already been determined." His eyes were full amber now, no gray at the edges, and it was the first time she had seen them that way. "I didn't want you to stay because the compact required it. I didn't want you to—" He stopped. The unfinished sentence occupied the space between them, I didn't want you to stay." She heard what it contained. She heard the word that would have followed if he had let it. The coal in her chest moved, became something with edges. "That's not your decision to make for me," she said. "Deciding what I can handle, what I should know, when I'm ready. That's not protecting me. That's just another form of," she searched for the word governance, "over something that belongs to me." He absorbed this. She watched it land and watched him not deflect it. "You're right," he said. 3 words, no qualification, no defense constructed from good intentions. She looked at him in the thinning afternoon light. This man who had watched her from the tree line and the ridge and had read her grandmother's history and had carried a knowledge about her life that she had not been given access to, and who had done all of it not from malice, but from a care that had overreached itself into control. And she felt both things simultaneously, clearly and without resolution, the anger, which was real and legitimate and not finished, and underneath it, persistent and inconvenient and entirely its own, the other thing. The thing that had been present since the archive, since the trail, since the first moment she had looked at amber-gray eyes across a room and felt her internal instruments recalibrate. She pocketed the carved disc. "I need time," she said, "to think." "I know," he said. She walked back toward the road. She did not look back, but she felt him standing at the trailhead, watching her go, with the specific quality of attention she was learning to distinguish from all other kinds, not surveillance, not possession. Something older and more helpless than either. The weight of someone who had been waiting for something their whole life, watching it walk away and not moving to stop it because stopping it would make it less itself. Chapter 8. When the ridge comes down to you. She gave herself 3 days. This was the number she decided on the walk back from the trailhead. 3 days to think, to read, to sit with the compound weight of which she now knew and feel it settle into something she could move around inside. She was not running. She was specific with herself about this distinction. Running was what she had done after her father left, after the relationship in Portland that had ended with the particular exhaustion of loving someone who needed constant management. Running felt like water leaving a container, fast, directionless, seeking the lowest point. This was different. This was stillness chosen deliberately. She was standing inside something enormous and giving her eyes time to adjust. She spent the first day at the cottage with the folder documents and Lucia's letter and the carved disc arranged on the kitchen table. She read everything twice more and took notes in the margins of her own notebook, and built, slowly, a framework for what she was understanding. The compact was not metaphor. The shifting was not metaphor. The bond that moved through bloodlines across generations was not metaphor. It was documented, recorded in multiple hands across 130 years, with the matter-of-fact thoroughness of people recording weather patterns or agricultural yields. It was simply a true thing that this valley contained, and the valley did not require her belief in order to continue containing it. The second day, she drove to the county library in the larger town 30 miles north and found 3 academic papers on Pacific Northwest indigenous territorial customs that mentioned, in footnotes, a valley settlement with unusual continuity of land stewardship. The footnotes did not explain the unusual continuity. Footnotes never did. The third day she walked, not the eastern trail. She took the path behind the cottage that climbed the western slope of the valley and switchbacks through second-growth timber and opened, at its highest point, onto a rocky outcrop above the fog line where she could see the full geography of Asheville laid out below. The town, the road, the dark ribbon of the creek, the eastern tree line where Route 9 ran, and beyond it the older forest rising toward the Black Shelf Ridge. She sat on the outcrop for 2 hours. She thought about Lucia writing in her careful, urgent hand at 20 years old. The fear and the knowing are not the same thing. And I know. She thought about what it had cost her grandmother to leave. Not the leaving itself, but the carrying. 60 years of carrying half a bond that had no other half. A recognition with nowhere to land. She was still sitting there when her phone rang. It was Bet. "You need to come to the archive," Bet said. There was something different in her voice. The pleasantness stripped out of it, the creek water clarity underneath. "Now, if you can." "What's happened?" "Callum will explain." A pause. "He's here, and he wouldn't come to you with this. He said that was your boundary to hold, so he came to me instead." Mara was in the car 11 minutes later. The archive was locked from the inside when she arrived. Bet let her in and relocked the door behind her with a bolt. Mara hadn't noticed before. Heavy, iron. The kind of hardware that was not original to a Victorian building and had been installed with a specific purpose in mind. Callum was at the central table. He looked different. Not in any way she could point to immediately, but different in the way that weather systems are different when the pressure drops. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table, and there was a quality to his stillness that was no longer the controlled, deliberate stillness she had catalogued before. This was the stillness of something contained by effort. His eyes, when he looked up, were fully amber. No gray at the edges. "There are 3 rogues in the valley," he said. No preamble. "They crossed the eastern boundary 2 nights ago. They're not from a local pack. They came from the coast ranges. They've been moving east for a month." "Rogues," Mara said. "Shifted without a pack. Without the compact structure." He held her gaze, unstable, territorial in ways that don't follow the usual patterns. He paused. "They've been near the cottage. I found sign this morning on the western slope. They crossed the creek bed overnight." The western slope. The path she had walked that morning. The switchbacks through the second-growth timber. "They were behind the cottage," she said flatly. "Yes," she sat down. Not from weakness, from the practical recognition that she needed to be in a chair to think clearly. "Why the cottage specifically?" she said. "Because you carry the compact bloodline," Callum said. "The valley's recognition of you has been audible to anything sensitive enough to hear it. A signal." His jaw tightened. "I should have anticipated this. When the valley responds to someone the way it's responded to you, it doesn't only reach the things that are aligned with it." "It reached the rogues too," Mara said. "Yes." Bet had moved to the window. Not obviously, but Mara registered her standing slightly to the side of it, looking out at Spur Street at an angle that suggested she was watching without being visible from outside. She was holding a phone and had not put it down since Mara arrived. "What happens now?" Mara said. Callum's hands on the table pressed flat, harder fractionally. She watched the tendons in his forearms move. "The pack will handle the rogues," he said. "That's not what I need to tell you." He looked at her steadily. "But until it's resolved, tonight, possibly into tomorrow, you can't be in the cottage alone. The western slope puts you within their range, and the cottage has no." He stopped, and she understood he was editing out a word that would require more explanation than the moment allowed. "No protection. You're saying I need to be somewhere else tonight." "I'm asking," he said. The distinction was deliberate. "I am asking. Not because the compact requires it. Not because the territory demands it." The amber in his eyes held steady, and something in them was open in a way she had not seen from him before, unguarded in the specific way that comes when someone has decided that a situation has made careful management beside the point. "Because I am asking you." The silence in the archive had a different quality than usual. The old building held it the way old buildings hold heat, slowly absorbed, slowly released. Mara thought about 3 days of deliberate stillness. She thought about the distinction she had made on the walk back from the trailhead, between running and standing inside something enormous while her eyes adjusted. She thought about Lucia's letter and the unfinished business of 60 years, and the carved disc in her jacket pocket that she had not stopped carrying since Portland. She thought about the western slope, and the path she had walked that morning, and something large and purposeless and unstable moving through the timber in the dark behind her cottage. "Your place," she said, "or the pack territory. Whichever Bet thinks is more defensible." Bet turned from the window with the expression of a woman who has been waiting, with considerable patience, for 2 people to arrive at a decision she made weeks ago. "Pack territory," she said. "The main house on the eastern ridge. It's been prepared." She paused. "It's been prepared since last week." Mara looked at Callum. He had the grace, or perhaps the honesty, not to look away. "Last week," Mara said. "I was hopeful," he said quietly. "Not presumptuous. There is a difference." "There is," she agreed. She stood and picked up her bag and looked at this man who had watched her from the tree line and carried her grandmother's history and withheld his own truth for reasons that were wrong in the right ways and right in the wrong ways, and who was looking at her now with amber eyes and open hands. And that particular hopeless quality of someone who has put everything they have on a table and is waiting to see what the other person does with it. "Show me the way," she said. Chapter 9. The Language Below Words. The main house on the eastern ridge was not what she expected. She had built something in her imagination during the drive, a compound perhaps, or something aggressively rustic. The kind of structure that announces its own significance. What she found at the end of a gravel track that climbed through old-growth fir and emerged onto a cleared plateau was a house that had simply grown from the place it stood. Stone foundation, timber frame, a wide covered porch that faced west across the valley, and windows that caught the last hour of October light and held it like something worth keeping. It was large in the way that things are large when they have accommodated many people over a long time, not in the way of display. Several vehicles were parked at the side, lights in the lower windows. As Callum pulled in, a woman came out onto the porch, mid-50s, solid dark hair cut short, an expression of complete competence, and nodded once at Callum, and then looked at Mara with an assessment that took approximately 3 seconds and apparently resolved itself satisfactorily. "Nora," Callum said. "My aunt. She runs the house." Nora came down the porch steps and took Mara's bag from her hand without asking. "I've put you in the east room," she said. "It has its own entrance if you need air." She said this with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who understood that guests in unusual circumstances sometimes needed exits that weren't about leaving. Then she went inside. Callum showed her the house. It was occupied. She could feel the presence of people in other rooms without seeing them, the particular distributed warmth of a place that functioned as a collective rather than a residence. Someone was cooking. Somewhere on the upper floor, a low conversation was happening. The house had the quality she had noticed in the archive's stillness, but amplified and reversed. Not the quiet of something held in, but the quiet of something fully inhabited. He showed her the east room last. It was at the end of a hallway on the ground floor with a door to the outside as Nora had promised, and a window that looked out through the firs toward the valley. The light was almost gone by the time they got there, the sky holding only a last thin line of pewter above the ridge line. "I'll be in the house," he said. "If anything, I know," she said. He nodded and moved to leave. "Callum." He stopped in the doorway. She had been carrying the question for 3 days, carrying it under the framework building, in the library research, and the 2 hours on the rocky outcrop above the fog line. It had been there the whole time, beneath the practical and the analytical, patient in the way that important things are. Patient because they understand that their turn will come. "What does it feel like?" she said. "The bond. From your side." He turned slowly. He stood in the doorway with the hallway light behind him and the last of the evening coming through the window, and he looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was unlike anything she had catalogued from him before. Not composed. Not careful. Not the controlled surface of a man who has learned to manage what he feels because what he feels is too large for ordinary rooms. Just his face. Looking at hers. "Like a compass," he said, "finding north." He paused. "Before you arrived in the valley, I knew approximately what direction you were in. Not precisely. Not enough to be. I wasn't tracking you." He said this carefully, and she heard the importance of it. "It was more like the awareness you have of weather, knowing a front is coming, knowing the pressure is shifting. And after you arrived, he said, it became specific." He looked at the window, at the last light, at something she couldn't see. "I know when you're in the cottage versus when you've left it. I know when something is wrong before you'd have reason to contact anyone. This morning, on the western slope, I knew before I found the sign that you had been on that path, because the urgency I felt about the rogues became..." He stopped. "Became personal in a way that had nothing to do with the compact." "Became personal," she repeated quietly. He looked back at her. "You asked what it feels like," he said. "It feels like something I have been moving toward my entire life without knowing I was moving. And then you walked into Bet's archive and it felt like arriving somewhere I had been before, in the way that places feel familiar in dreams." He paused. "And then I was afraid. Because familiarity isn't consent. Because what the valley knows and what you choose are not the same thing and should not be." She crossed the room. Not all the way. She stopped 4 feet from him in the doorway's threshold and looked up at him in the last of the October light. Up close like this, She could see things she had filed as impressions from a distance, and now had to reckon with as facts the particular texture of his stillness, the warmth that came off him at a level that was physiologically not quite ordinary, the amber in his eyes that had gone dark and deep in the low light. "I have been afraid too," she said. "I want you to know that. It's not a comfortable thing, what I feel. It doesn't feel chosen, and you're right that chosen matters." She held his gaze. "But I've also been sitting with it for 3 days and the fear keeps reducing. The other thing does not." "What's the other thing?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "You describe it as a compass finding north," she said. "Mine is different. Mine is more like recognition. The way you read a sentence in another language, you were never taught and understand it anyway, and you don't know how you understand it, only that you do." Something moved through his face, the fast, uncontrolled sequence she had seen once before at the trailhead, too quick to manage. He reached up slowly and brushed a strand of hair from her face, one gesture, barely a touch. His fingertips at her temple for half a second, and she felt it travel the full length of her nervous system like a chord being struck. He lowered his hand. "The carved disc," he said. She took it from her pocket. He took it from her palm without touching her hand, and turned it over, and she watched the thing that happened to his expression when he held it. Grief and recognition and something that had waited a very long time to be restored. "My great-uncle carved this," he said. He gave it to Lucia the night before she left. He said she should keep it until the bond completed itself. He turned it in his fingers. He died not knowing if it would. "She kept it for 60 years, Mara said. "I know." His voice had roughened. "I know she did. The house held them in its warmth and its old wood, and its accumulated decades of people who had known exactly what they were. Below them, the valley lay in the dark, and on the ridge above, things were moving that were none of them, the pack, doing what the pack had always done, maintaining the boundary against what came in wrong." Mara thought about Lucia at 20, standing at a threshold, with half a bond in her chest and 60 years ahead of her in which to carry it alone. She thought about arriving at a place her blood already knows. "I'm not leaving," she said. It was not a declaration for his benefit. It was simply a fact. She was speaking aloud for the first time, making it real in the way that spoken things become real. Given to the air, irrevocable. Callum looked at her with amber eyes in the dark and said nothing. Because some things don't require an answer. He set the carved disc carefully on the windowsill, where the last gray light could find it, and she understood this as what it was, the completing of something set in motion in this same valley 60 years ago in October, by two people who had found each other too real to dismiss and too frightening to keep. She sat on the edge of the bed. He sat beside her. Not close. Not yet, but present in the way that mattered, fully, without management, without the careful rationing of exposure she had watched him practice for 2 weeks. Just present. Outside, the first clouds crossed the moon and the valley breathed, and somewhere on the eastern ridge a wolf called once into the dark and was answered by several voices, low and certain. The sound of something old and intact and exactly where it was meant to be. Chapter 10. The compact earns its name. She woke at 3 a.m. to silence of the wrong kind. Not the inhabited silence of the house settling. Not the valley breathing in its slow nocturnal rhythm. This was the silence she had learned on Route 9, the kind that arrives when something larger than the usual things enters the territory and everything else goes still in response. No wind. No movement in the firs outside the east room window. Even the house itself had changed quality, its warmth contracting slightly, the way a living thing contracts when it becomes alert. Mara was upright before she was fully awake. The carved disc on the windowsill was doing something she had no framework for. In the moonless dark of the room it held a faint luminescence. Not light exactly, more like the quality of a surface that has absorbed warmth and is now releasing it. She stared at it for 2 seconds, and then moved to the window. The clearing between the house and the tree line was empty. The vehicles were where they had been. The porch light cast its usual small perimeter of yellow. Everything looked as it should and felt entirely wrong, and she trusted the feeling over the appearance without having to decide to. She was reaching for her jacket when the east room door opened. Nora, fully dressed, phone in hand, expression stripped of everything but function. "They're at the southern perimeter," Nora said quietly. "All 3. They've been moving the boundary for the last hour. Testing it." She handed Mara a flashlight. Callum says stay in the house. The pack is mobilizing on the south slope. Where is he? Already out. Mara's chest registered this, a cold, specific compression. The compass she had described lurching toward an orientation that felt like urgency without a name. How bad, she said. Nora looked at her with the same 3-second assessment she had deployed on arrival. Then, apparently deciding that Mara could carry the honest answer, she said, 3 rogues without compact structure means 3 animals without the behavioral regulation the bond provides. They're not tactical, they're not organized, they're reactive. She paused. Reactive is sometimes more dangerous than organized. Because you can't predict it, Mara said. Because they've been drawn here by the valley's signal and now they're running on something more primitive than strategy. Nora's eyes moved to the window briefly. They want what the valley is resonating toward. They can't claim it. The compact doesn't work that way, but that won't stop them from trying to disrupt it. Mara thought, what the valley is resonating toward, thought of the carved disc behind her still holding its strange warmth, thought of 60 years of an incomplete bond and the signal its completion must be sending into whatever frequencies the valley used, thought of Callum on a dark southern slope with 3 unregulated, shifted things that had been drawn here by her bloodline. She was out the east room door before she completed the thought. Nora said her name once, sharply from behind her. Mara kept moving. The night air hit her like cold water. Clean, immediate, the temperature carrying the particular edge of October that felt like a warning about what winter would do when it arrived properly. She went left around the house, away from the porch light, and let her eyes adjust. The clearing, the tree line, the Grayley track curving south. She heard them before she saw anything, not sound exactly. The sound was below that, a register she felt in her sternum rather than her ears. 3 points of pressure in the dark, moving in a pattern that was not random. She had no reference for how she knew this. She simply knew it. The way she had understood the amber eyes on Route 9 before she had language to describe what she was understanding. The tree line at the south corner of the clearing broke. One of them came through fast, large, dark, with the particular wrongness of something that had shifted without the compact structure giving the shift its proper weight. Mara had tried to prepare for this moment intellectually and found, standing in it, that intellectual preparation was entirely beside the point. It was large in the way that force is large. It moved with the erratic speed of something that was reacting rather than deciding. It stopped 20 feet from her. She did not run. She had not run on Route 9. She had not run in the archive, or the trail, or any of the thresholds she had stood in over the past 2 weeks. Running was not the thing her body knew how to do in the presence of something that required her to be specific about who she was. She held up the carved disc. She did not decide to do this. Her hand was simply in her jacket pocket, and then it was not, and the disc was in her palm between them. The faint luminescence she had seen in the room was different out here, stronger, or rather more present, the way a voice is more present in a room than through a wall. The rogue stopped moving, not cowed. She didn't think cowed was the right word, more like interrupted, like a sentence that had been building towards something and had encountered a word it needed to reckon with before continuing. From the tree line south, 2 things happened almost simultaneously. A sound, low, resonant, the frequency below language she had heard from the ridge 9 days ago, came from deep in the southern slope, not a call, an assertion. The kind of sound that says this is what I am and where I stand in a language older than any she had been taught. And a second rogue, which had come through the tree line behind and to the left of the first, stopped. Then the first rogue turned. She understood later, when she had time to assemble it, that what she had done with the disc had not repelled them. It had done something more specific. It had made the compact legible to them, had made the valley's resonance intelligible in a way that pure bloodline signal was not. The disc was a key that the compact had built into itself over a century and a half, carried by a woman who left and kept it anyway. Returned now to the territory that had made it. 3 things happened in fast succession. Callum came through the southern tree line, shifted, and she saw him fully for the first time. Not the man in the canvas jacket, but the thing the man carried inside him, immense and amber-eyed and moving with a purposeful silence that made the rogue's movement look like noise. He was not the cold, deliberate, carefully distanced person from the archive. He was completely what he was, without management, without the work of containing it. The two visible rogues moved back, and from either side of the clearing, 4 more shapes emerged from the tree line, pack, compact-bound, structured, and placed themselves in a perimeter that was not aggressive so much as absolute, the statement of a boundary that had been maintained for 130 years and was not negotiating its terms tonight. The third rogue appeared at the north tree line, behind Mara. She felt it before she heard it. The compass lurching violently, every instinct sharpening to a point. She turned. It was closer than the others had been, close enough that she could see the irregularity in it, the quality of something that had shifted without the bond's regulation to give the shift coherence. Its eyes were not amber. They were pale and flat and moving with the reactive speed of something that had not chosen to be here and could not choose to leave. Mara stepped forward, not back. Forward. She held the disc up and she said with a clarity that came from somewhere below decision, "This valley knows me, and I know it." The words sounded different aloud than they had in her mind. Not loud, not dramatic, but weighted with something that was not hers alone. She felt it as she said it. The valley, the ridge, the compact, the 60 years of Lucia carrying half a bond in a California house while the other half sat on an eastern ridge in Oregon and waited. All of it present in the moment, completing a circuit. The third rogue stopped. Then it turned, and the 3 of them moved back into the dark, not fleeing, but withdrawing. The way pressure withdraws when the surface it has been pressing against proves more solid than it anticipated. The clearing held its silence. Then Callum was beside her, shifted back, the canvas jacket gone, but present in a way that required no jacket and no words. His hand found her shoulder and turned her toward him, and she looked up at his face, fully unguarded in the dark. Amber eyes gone soft with something that had nothing to do with the compact and everything to do with the 2 of them specifically. "I told you to stay in the house," he said. "I heard you," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then he made a sound that was almost, in its most restrained form, a laugh. She felt it through his hand on her shoulder. Brief, involuntary, the laugh of a man being shown, again, exactly who she was. Behind them, the pack reformed the perimeter. The valley breathed. The disc in her palm was warm. Chapter 11. What the valley keeps 3 weeks after the night of the rogues, the first snow came to Ashevale. Not the tentative dusting that sometimes arrived in late October and melted by noon. This was the real thing. The season declaring itself. 4 inches overnight that turned the valley into something that looked like the inside of a held breath. Mara stood on the main house porch at dawn and watched it and felt, for the first time in her adult life, that she was standing in the exact place she was supposed to be standing. She had not gone back to Portland. This had not been a dramatic decision. There had been no moment of declaration, no conscious threshold crossed. She had simply found, in the days after the rogues, that each reason she generated for leaving was less convincing than the one before it, until she stopped generating them and started noticing what was actually true. That the cottage felt like hers in a way her Portland apartment never had. That she woke in the mornings already oriented in a direction that had nothing to do with compass points. That the valley had a quality she recognized now as what her grandmother had meant by the land knowing the blood. She had called her editor and negotiated remote work through the winter. She had called her mother and said simply, "I found it, Mama." Elena had been quiet for a long moment and then said, with a steadiness that suggested she had been waiting for this call without knowing it, "I know. She always said you would." The pack had driven the rogues to the western boundary and held it for 48 hours to ensure they did not return. Nora had explained this with the practical brevity of someone briefing on logistics, and Mara had listened and asked operational questions and felt, somewhere in the back of her mind, the ongoing recalibration of everything she had understood about the world as recently as October 1st. It was not a comfortable process. It was, however, a real one, and she had decided early in her life that real and comfortable were not the same requirement. Callum came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside her in the snow-quiet morning and handed her one without speaking. This was something she had learned about him in 3 weeks of being in genuine proximity rather than careful archive distance. He was not a person who filled silence because silence made him uneasy. He was a person who let silence be what it was and trusted that it communicated something that words would diminish. She had learned other things too. That he had been running the Eastern Territory since his father's death 11 years ago. At 24, without the compact's completion and therefore without the full stability the bond was supposed to provide the alpha, that he had done this through a combination of discipline and sheer determined competence and the pack's loyalty, and that it had cost him in ways she was only beginning to map, that the distance she had catalogued from him in the archive, the controlled rationing of exposure, the careful management of what he felt, was not his native state, but something he had constructed over years of carrying something unfinished. She had learned that he read in the early mornings before anyone else was up, historical texts mostly, and that he cooked badly and knew it and defaulted to letting Nora run the kitchen without ego, that he was unexpectedly patient with the two youngest pack members, teenagers who required more managing than all the adults combined, that when he laughed, genuinely not the almost laugh she had heard in the clearing, it was quick and surprised, as though amusement caught him off guard each time, and it changed his space completely. She had learned that the bond, from the inside, was not the consuming obliteration of self that she had feared it might be. It was more like, the word she kept returning to was grammar, a structure beneath experience that made certain things legible that had not been legible before. She still had her own thoughts, her own directions, her own arguments with him, which were frequent and productive, and occasionally loud. She was still entirely herself, but herself now had a context it had been missing, the way a sentence has meaning that its individual words, alone, do not carry. Bet wants to formalize the compact documentation, Callum said. He was looking at the valley below, the snow-softened tree line, the thin smoke from town visible above the firs. There's a process. It requires witnesses and the carved disc and a date aligned with the lunar calendar. When? Mara asked. 3 weeks. The full moon in December. She turned her cup in her hands. The coffee was too hot to drink yet, and she held it for warmth. The snow on the porch railing was 3 inches deep and perfectly undisturbed. Will it change anything? She asked. What we are. What's already. She gestured slightly with the cup, indicating the space between them that was no longer the carefully calibrated distance of the archive but something else entirely. Already real. No, he said. The compact is already complete. The documentation is for the record. He paused, and for the ones who come after. The ones who come after. He let this sit in her. She thought about Lucia's letter. The urgent handwriting, the pressed white flower, the carved disc kept for 60 years in a wooden box under a bed in California. She thought about the unfinished sentence in that letter. The place where Lucia had stopped writing mid-thought and never resumed. The white space on the page that Mara had read as grief, but understood now as something more complicated. Not only grief, the particular white space of someone who had known something true and had not had a language yet that could hold it completely. She thought about Elena, who had made a promise and kept it for decades, who had raised Mara on the edge of a story she could not yet tell, who had handed over a wooden box in a kitchen in Portland with the expression of someone finally putting down a weight that was never supposed to be hers to carry. I want to bring my mother here, she said, before the December date. Callum looked at her. Something moved in his face. A softness she had learned to recognize as the expression he produced when something she said landed in him at a depth he hadn't been anticipating. Yes, he said. Nora will want to prepare the house. Nora will prepare the house regardless of when I tell her, Mara said. She'll start tomorrow. Probably tonight, he agreed. They stood with their coffee in the first snow, and the valley spread below them, white and still and held. From the tree line at the southern edge of the clearing, a single wolf emerged and stood at the perimeter looking up at the house. Young, she thought, from its proportions, and then turned and moved back into the trees with the unhurried certainty of something that knew its territory completely. Mara thought about Route 9 on an October night, 3 weeks ago, when her car had died on a road that had no business frightening her and had frightened her anyway. She thought about amber eyes of the tree line, and the disturbed fog and the sound she had made, before she knew anything, before she understood a single element of what she was walking into. I see you. She had said it to the dark and to the unknown, and to something she had no framework for, and it had been the truest thing she'd said in years. Not because she had understood what she was seeing, but because she had been willing to see it, to stand in the road in the cold and not look away. She leaned into Callum's side. He shifted his weight to accommodate her without comment, without ceremony, with the ease of something that had been true for a long time and had only recently been given permission to be visible. The snow fell on the valley in soft, unhurried increments. The firs held it on their branches and released it in small cascades when the wind moved through. The carved disc sat on the kitchen windowsill inside where she had left it, and the morning light, coming now fully over the ridge, found it through the glass and made it briefly luminous. Somewhere below, in the town Ashvale, Bit Calloway was opening the archive and setting her kettle on and taking out a new folder, clean, empty, waiting for the documentation that would complete a record begun in 1887 and interrupted in 1962 and continued now, in December, in the hand of a woman who had driven a dark highway and stepped out into the cold and looked at the unknown and said with a clarity she hadn't known she possessed, "I see you," and meant it, and stayed.